Thank you. Good morning. Good afternoon, actually. So, I'd like to talk to you about some research that we did at the National Cybersecurity Center in the Netherlands, together with some colleagues from the University of Delft, University of Twente, and SIDN Labs, the registrar of the Netherlands. DNS is important, and who recognizes this haiku? Yeah, who's actually lived through this haiku? Yeah, so the idea is DNS is an important service, and it's always there, and it's always helpful. And if you have some problem in your infrastructure, at first you don't think about DNS because it's always there, and then you continue investigating, and you still don't think it's DNS, and then it ends up being DNS. Because many things can go wrong with DNS. And many things can go wrong with DNS, and this is being used in conflicts. So the Ukrainians, they attacked part of a Russian infrastructure, and from the University of Twente we do monitoring, so we were able to see that for several days the IT army of Ukraine was successful in taking down parts of the infrastructure in Russia. And then we started investigating, and actually we found a very good example of how not to run a DNS server. So the mail.ru domain, they were under attack from March 11th to March 18th. Our scanner was unable to resolve it during that period, so it was really unavailable on the internet. But all three names, there were three name servers, which was actually, so that's good, sort of. But they were all unicast, but they were all hosted on the same company, on the same prefix. So if you attack them and you take down the prefix, nothing works. And this, of course, also happens in other countries. And it happens in the Netherlands, where we have TransIP, which is one of the big registrars in the Netherlands. They had some severe attacks. In December 2020, the round trip time, so the time to resolve a name increased for 8 hours, and in 2021, 20% of the queries failed to resolve at all. And why is this one important? Well, this is one of the DNS servers and the DNS services that provide many services to the Dutch infrastructure. So this is why we started thinking about, well, should we investigate how this works and how this is set up, and whether they actually apply all of the best practices that we think of for DNS today. And this is not just in the Netherlands. There's also many attacks that happen on governments in the US, and I'm sure that there are many more examples in other countries as well. Why focus on governments? Well, governments are increasingly providing digital services, and if these digital services are not available, then you as a citizen, you can't make use of those services that are often very necessary. And sometimes it can be a pain that it's not available for several times or several days, but sometimes it's it's critical that these are available. So what we looked into was an evaluation of the infrastructure of electronic government services, but then looking strictly at the DNS providers. Because if the DNS provider is not available, then the whole domain name isn't available. We looked for both web and email services, and then we focused on the DNS best practices and the IP-based redundancy, and we measured that. So what does that look like? So if you know a little bit about DNS, then you know that from your computer, at the bottom, you start resolving If you have a default configuration, then you use your modem, the request is forwarded to your ISP, and then maybe several other levels, and at some point you end up at the authoritative name server. And the authoritative name server is the one that actually gives the answer, and then that trickles down towards the client. We are only looking at the authoritative name servers at the top, because they are the ones that provide the answer. There can be caching that helps, but then the authoritative name servers also define how that caching works and how long something is cached. So we also look at that. But for the purpose of this study, we only looked at the top part of the DNS. And what is it that we look at? The example.nl, for example, is an example zone. In the zone file, there are two name server records defined, so NS1 and NS2. One is in the .nl zone and one is in the .com zone. They both have an A record, and then we looked up, for that A record, we looked up the AS number to figure out where it's hosted, whether it's a different service, and we concluded the redundancy from that. So we looked at the A records, the quad A records for IPv6, and the MX records for the domain for the email services. We used 4 different data sets in 4 different countries because they were available. So we had a list of electronic government organizations that we got from the NCSC that we provided to them. We got answers from the Swiss registry through Switch. We had a list from Sweden. And finally, we had a list that was publicly available for the US for .gov. We noticed that for many of these domains, there was roughly 40% that only had a single authoritative DNS provider. And that's not really a good practice. The best practice is to have at least 2 and maybe more. .gov has 80% single DNS providers, but this is not necessarily a bad thing, as we'll see later, because they have some other ways to solve that redundancy. But then if you look at the organizations that actually supply these kind of services, we see that there's a handful of DNS providers that operate in most domains. One of the interesting examples that we saw is that Microsoft actually has a very big part in Sweden. And when we looked into that, it turns out that these were hosted in the Azure cloud. So they were cloud-based domains. You'll see here also that TransIP is the top provider, the one that had the problems that we approached them later with our best practices, and they're trying to improve on that. Most of these government domains are actually provided by local services, so that's probably a good thing. That helps you do this quickly. When we looked at the diversity in these providers, we actually saw that a third of the Swiss domains were actually on the same network prefix. So this is a cumulative distribution graph showing how much the fractions of answers and how quickly you get all of the prefixes. For IPv6, it's really bad. There's very few prefixes, and so 40% of the domains in Switzerland have no IPv6 at all, and then the rest is on a single prefix. If we look at other TLDs, like we mentioned before, most of the government domains actually depend on their own TLDs, at least in Europe. And for governments for .gov in the US, you could say that it's their own TLD also with .com, but this is more like an international one. But most of them are in a local domain. As I mentioned earlier, the US has a lot of them have a single DNS provider, but they solve this problem. They provide the reliability by using anycast. And the anycast means that there's a single IP address that is resolved or that is available or announced from different ways, so it provides different connectivity from different parts of the world. And this helps you very much against DDoS. So many of the content distribution networks work in this way. And this is a very effective way to be robust against DDoS, because then the effect of a DDoS is distributed automatically because of the anycast way. And if it is successful in parts of the world, then only that part of the world is unavailable. And as I mentioned, 58% of the .gov domain have one or more anycast DNS servers. But we also see that very few of the Swiss domain servers actually have this available. And in the Netherlands and Sweden, there is very little anycast availability. But we actually think that this would be a very good thing to do. I mentioned the caching in the beginning, and the TTL that a authoritative DNS server provides is the hint or the suggestion for the caching time that a caching resolver would use to cache the answer. The recommended in the RFCs is to have 24 hours. But actually, most of the NS records are only there for 1 hour. And there's no real reason to have this very low, TTL, because you don't very often move your name server. So there's no actual real reason to have this only cached for 1 hour. For A and Quad A, there may be some better reasons to have some agility with caching, but we do see that the caching times there are very low, and it would help a lot with the resistance against DDoS and availability to have these higher. That maybe makes you a little bit less dynamic, but very often if you do these kind of changes to your infrastructure, you know this in advance. So you can plan this and you can lower your TTL and then bring it back up again after you've applied this change. This is a result. We looked at the top email providers for all of the domains, and actually this has me a little bit worried that Outlook is the top mail provider for all of the domains that we saw. So all of many of the government domains actually send their mail to Outlook and then read it from there, meaning that Outlook can probably look in and analyze all of these mails. Fortunately, for other parts of the network, for health services, there are other providers that we at least see in the Netherlands. In other domains, this is different, and we were unable to identify that. Google is only really present in the .gov domains and not very popular in Europe, it seems. The recommendations that we found that we would suggest for everyone running a DNS server for government services: have at least a second DNS provider. And if you have that, then also make sure that it's on a different network, on a different prefix, hosted in a different AS, and preferably also in a different data center. Set higher TTL levels for your DNS records, so that enables more caching, makes you more robust against unavailability of your DNS servers, and actually has better robustness. And one of the suggestions that we had was also to deploy more IP anycast servers. And maybe for central governments, so many of the domains that we analyzed were actually for the decentralized governments, so municipalities, etc. They very often outsource this to to some kind of hosting provider. But then we suggest that the central government provides at least an anycast secondary name server, which is very easy to set up and very easy to add to your name, to your infrastructure, because you just add the record. The secondary DNS server just needs to know that it must accept this, and then you can run this, and it's very flexible, and provides a lot of robustness for the government services. So we would really recommend central governments to investigate deploying an anycast DNS server. And with that, I'm actually through my slides very quickly. So if you have any questions, please ask away.
Thank you for the presentation. I would subscribe to almost all of your recommendations, despite one. I would be careful about set higher TTL values. That's a good thing in the perspective of availability, but you know, things break, and if you make an error, it could be extremely painful to get this error corrected if everybody says higher TTL values. And a lot of people might read this like put in 72 hours or even longer. There's always a balance between how robust I am against not being reached and how robust I am against maybe my own faults. And especially in the context of DNSSEC, I would be very careful to use higher TTL values.
Yes, no, definitely. But there's a balance between 1 hour and the recommended best practice of 24 hours. 1 hour is actually too short, probably. It helps you, but it is really short, and it means that we have a lot more DNS traffic than is necessary. I do see your point that especially with DNSSEC that it's very complicated and very easy to make mistakes. So yes, you do need to balance that and set a sensible level, yeah.
Any more comments or questions?
Thank you for the session. Would you say that these recommendations could apply also for any organizations, not only government, but that, like any private companies, for example?
Yes. I mean, most of these apply for commercial organizations as well. Save, of course, for the government providing an anycast DNS server for commercial organizations. That might not be. There could be some market disruption parts that make that not possible. But having an anycast DNS server, if you provide a service that is essential, that it's up, if you have some kind of digital service provider, then it really makes sense to have an anycast DNS server. Yeah.
Anyone else? If not, then I want to say thank you again very much to Jeroen for the talk.
Thank you very much.